Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, April 17th, 2014. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week we go back to basics as we talk to Chris Colby, editor of Beer and Wine Journal, about non-barley brewing grains. What are they? How much do we use? And how do we use them? If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. You can find me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. On Facebook, I'm at facebook.com/basicbrewing.james, and our show page on Facebook is at facebook.com/basicbrewing. We're on Google Plus, too. Thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link at our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you the show. We greatly appreciate your support. We have associate links for Brew Your Own Magazine, the American Homebrewers Association, on our site as well. Our Basic Brewing iPhone app is on iTunes, and our Android app is on Amazon.com. We're in the BlackBerry Podcast Directory. We're in the Stitcher app. We're in the Windows Phone Directory, all over the place. Check out a brewer's logbook at basicbrewingshop.com. In the front is a blank calendar that you can use to track your fermentations and plan your brews. And there is room in the back to log the details of up to 50 batches of beer. If you want to put a tip in our tip jar, some coinage in our guitar case, you can go to basicbrewing.com/support. Thanks to everybody who has done so already. And protect your precious beer with one of our growler bags. Check those out at basicbrewingshop.com. According to tracking information, the new shipment of Basic Brewing bottle openers should be here on Friday. Then the openers and the DVD combos will go back up on the shop, and I will try not to run out again. Steve Wilkes and I shot an episode of Basic Brewing Video yesterday evening that I hope to have up by Friday as well. We taste an easy-peasy Pilsner that I brewed this past January. It's fairly rare that I brew a lager, maybe once a year, but the temperature in the basement was just right for the purpose back in January, and the beer has held up very well in the keg since then. It's a very simple beer, just German Pilsner malt and Czech Saaz hops, brewed in a simple way, a single infusion, single temperature infusion mash, but the results are very, very tasty. I gave Steve some homemade sauerkraut to pair up with the beer, and he fried that up in the style of his grandmother, along with some German egg noodles, and that was also a very simple and delicious process. And on the show, Steve basically cooks up the recipe in real time, so you can just see just how easy it is. And to top it all off, Steve prepared a slow-roasted pork roast to a Boston butt to round out the plate, and man, was it good. It just proves you don't always have to be complicated to make great food and good beer. So check that out later this week. Well, let's go on to our conversation with Chris Colby. We've been talking about some pretty advanced stuff lately on the show. A lot about, things such as sour brewing, which is maybe not something you want to get into right away. So if you're getting started at least. So I thought we should spend some time back in our roots, which are the basics of home brewing. And it's hard to find a basic topic that we haven't covered in the more than 400 audio episodes that we've recorded over the past, 9 years. But thanks to a suggestion on Facebook, we have a winner. Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me on the show.
You're doing a series on beerandwinejournal.com right now on all grain brewing. It's not what we're going to talk about today, but I think it makes a nice pairing, so to speak. What have you covered so far, and what are you going to cover?
Well, the idea is I'm doing what I call an all-grain brew day walkthrough. The idea is to go step-by-step through the things you do on brew day in the order, and both give beginning all-grain brewers a look at, here's what you do step-by-step, and also hopefully give enough different, options or just reasons, like here's why you should do this for intermediate, all-grain brewers to take a look at it and maybe find something that they would like to incorporate into their brewing procedures.
And as usual, it's a good read, so everybody should check that out. You also did a more advanced article on enzymes as well.
Yeah, I'm going to wrap that up this week, too. We did a story on enzymes. A lot of times what you read in the brewing literature is, at best, it's sort of applied science, and they only tell you the bits of enzymes that you absolutely need to know. And at worst, it's somebody who's only read the applied stuff and then is trying to write about it and, make some assumptions or errors or whatever. And anyway, in graduate school, I took 2 semesters of molecular biology, so I know what an enzyme is. And, the basic idea is just present a little bit of an overview of what enzymes are, how they work, with the idea it's not going to change, the way you brew radically, but it'll just give you a little better feel for what enzymes are, how they work. And it might, like a lot of things, knowing a little bit more about it, it might help you in a case where something goes wrong. Like if you mash in too low or mash in too high, do you need to panic? Do you need to, what do you need to do? And how, sometimes people mash in too high and they'll say, well, it says in this book that, you're over this denaturation temperature. But if you know a little bit about enzymes, you know that they don't denature in a second. It takes time for things to occur. And so mashing in a little high is and this is one thing I'll get into, is not necessarily a game breaker. If you can get some, room temperature tap water into the mash and cool it down relatively quickly, you'll probably be okay. That sort of stuff.
I think novice brewers or newbie brewers are sometimes surprised at how forgiving the brewing process is. And they freak out over, 1 or 2 degrees on one side or the other of their target temperature. And most of the time you don't have to worry about it too much.
Right. And also just whenever I read anything about enzymes, especially on like the chat boards, it's just half the time I'm just shaking my head because, people will say stuff like this enzyme is active from this temperature to this temperature. And that's just flat out wrong. That's just not how enzymes work. They don't switch on and off, at temperatures or whatever. And that's something I'll go into in that article too, on kinetics and what does that mean when, the practical brewing range is given as something, and then it means something quite different than the enzyme is inactive below that and above that range, Well,
it sounds like a topic for another show. In the meantime, you can check out what Chris is writing on beerandwinejournal.com. But the reason I wanted to get it together today was that Thomas wrote on our Facebook page, facebook.com/basicbrewing. But anyway, Thomas says, here's a show idea. When and how do you use adjuncts such as unmalted wheat, flaked oats, oatmeal, etc., and in what quantities? And I looked in the archives because a lot of times people ask questions and I wind up just sending them links to previous shows in the archives because we've been doing this for, it'll be 9 years in July. Oh, gosh. So there's a lot of stuff out there. And Andy Sparks and I did cover adjuncts in kind of a general way on one of the earlier shows. But I thought this would be a good idea to get together with you and to talk about different grains that we can use, their properties, why you would want to use them, how to use them, such as that. But first, let's start out by talking about barley. And before we move on to the quote-unquote adjunct grains, why in our brewing is barley the dominant grain? I mean, why is it that barley is so darn good at making beer?
Well, that's a good question. And I think there are both technical reasons having to do with the characteristics of barley and historic reasons. If you look around the globe, I mean, people have always used locally grown grain to make some sort of alcoholic beverage. In Japan, they make sake, which is sometimes called rice wine, even though it's made from a grain and therefore a kind of beer. Uh, in South America, they used chicha, or in Mexico at least, or they made chicha, which is like it's masticated, chewed corn that's then fermented. Um, in Africa, they did and still do use sorghum, which is a grain that's grown there. And I think, one of the reasons why we, in the United States are dominated by barley-based beers, it's partly because our beer drinking traditions come mainly from like the British and European, and especially German brewing traditions that used those grains. And then for the reason that they use those grains is, from what they had to choose from, at least historically, maybe they didn't have so much rice, but, they'd had corn, wheat, barley, oats, rye, maybe triticale, I don't know, but barley it's a nice combination of sort of, it's a fairly big grain. It's not the individual kernels aren't as big as corn, but they're, fairly hefty. They're in the range of wheat. The amount of protein in barley is enough to supply the yeast with just enough nutrition, but not enough to make a cloudy beer when fermented with a Saccharomyces cerevisiae. For example, wheat has, on average, at least a couple percent more wheat, or not wheat, a couple percent more protein in it. Good malting barley is 12% protein or below, and most wheat is on the range of 14% and above. And then in contrast to that, both corn and starch are much lower than that. So barley's sort of in that sweet spot for the protein range. It's also got a husk, which helps, louder. It's also not wheat in the sense that wheat has a lot of gluten in it, and it's very useful for making pasta and bread, and barley's much less good at that. So, wheat was used in ancient times. People wanted to use the wheat for making bread because it was the one grain that could, of the ones they had. And, they relied on barley for animal feed and for beer brewing.
So if barley is so good, why do we want to use other grains other than barley?
Well, there's two reasons. One might just be availability. I know during World War II, in fact, in the United States, barley was rationed, and brewers were left to use other sort of grains to take up the bill, and other starches. Like apparently there was a big brewery at the time called the Lucky Brewery, and they relied on potatoes for a large amount of the starch in their. So there's availability. Sometimes there's cost. Like a lot of Belgian brewers will use unmalted barley as a percentage of their grist, because unmalted barley costs about half as much as malted barley. And the same goes sometimes, depending on farm prices, for corn and rice. And another reason can be, flavor or other characteristics. Like you're brewing a German style wheat beer, you want a little bit of that cloudiness, from the protein. You want a little bit of that haze, and also just the sort of, quote unquote snap of wheat. Or, these days with American brewers, for a lot of hoppy beers, people are incorporating some rye into the mix because it has that nice sort of twang that you get from rye. So, yeah, using other grains can be availability, including maybe you're a home brewer and you've grown some grains in your garden and you want to use it in your beer. It can be cost, and it can be, a purposeful way to try to change the characteristics of your beer in some desirable way.
So let's go down a list of the most frequently used adjunct grains. And you mentioned wheat, and it probably is the number one, a non-barley brewing grain, at least in our brewing traditions, right?
Well, probably maize is followed by rice. I mean, in our brewing traditions, you're in mine, yes. But in American brewing traditions, overall,
that's true. If we're looking at volume of beer produced,
a lot of corn beer and rice beer gets made both here and so yeah, I'd say corn and rice first. Wheat, definitely in the craft brewing realm, wheat is definitely probably number one. And then there's rye and oats, and from there anything goes. People have used grains of paradise, sorghum, teff, quinoa. You've brewed with sunflower seeds.
Yeah, I've brewed with the malted sunflower seeds from the Colorado Malting Company, and that's on the list. But let's before we get ahead of ourselves, let's talk about wheat. If you were wanting to brew a wheat beer, first of all, how much would you want to use as a percentage of the grain bill?
Well, it sort of depends on. And with wheat, you can use malted wheat, which is something you can stir right into your mash. You can use flaked wheat, which is also something you can stir right into your mash. And you can also use raw wheat, which, unlike some other grains, as a raw grain, you can also just stir directly into your mash. You don't need to cereal cook it because the gelatinization temperature is fairly low in wheat. So yeah, and how much to use just sort of depends on what you want to do. A lot of sort of American wheat beer style wheat beers are about 50% wheat, 50% wheat malt, 50% malted barley. In Germany, the sort of classic quote unquote formulation is 70% wheat malt to 30% barley malt. And in Belgium, there's wheat beers that run the gamut from small amounts of wheat, maybe 10 to 20%, up to ones that are probably the majority of the malt is wheat. And then there's also for Belgian brewers, they'll frequently use unmalted wheat in part of their beers, especially for saisons and sort of farmhouse ales and the like.
Now, with some of these grains, if you get above a certain percentage, unless you use something like rice hulls in your traditional mash tun, you are running the risk of sticking your mash or creating this gloopy mess in your mash tun that's going to seize up, and then you won't get your wort out. It'll all be stuck in there with the gloopy grains. So what is the percentage that is safe for a home brewer if you're making a wheat beer?
For the absolute top, I don't know. It would partly be based on how you lauter it, because you've got two things going on with wheat. One is it doesn't have a hull, so there's no, like on barley, there's a husk that helps set up the grain bed for lautering, and with wheat, you don't have that. And second, there's just more beta glucans in wheat. It's not to the extent that there is in rye, but it's your mash is going to be slightly more gummy with a little bit of wheat. And if you use malted wheat, I wouldn't be afraid to go 80-20. Beyond that, I would start to worry a little bit, but I haven't done that. And this assumes that you're doing some sort of lautering technique where you run water through it. If you do a brew in a bag, you don't have to worry, just let it drain. So yeah, I would, the 70-30 mix for, standard German Hefeweizens that's probably getting pretty close to the range where you'd have difficulties. I mean, I'm sure they chose a mix sort of just outside. I'm not sure, but it at least stands to reason that they would choose a mix just sort of, outside of the boundaries of where you might start to have some problems with lautering.
Yeah, you mentioned brew in a bag. I have made 100% wheat beers using brew in a bag.
Yep.
You don't have to worry about lautering or sparging or the stuff getting stuck in there because you can just squeeze the bag and squeeze out your wort like a sponge, and it works very well. But what characteristics are we looking for in our wheat beers? I mean, what does wheat bring to the table?
Wheat brings there's a characteristic flavor, or sometimes called like a snap, to the taste of wheat. It's hard to describe. Some people call it bready because there are elements that are similar to bread. It also brings there's the slight cloudiness from the protein, and there's a little bit thicker mouthfeel. So wheat brings a variety of things to the table. And then, of course, if you're making a soured beer, for some reason, sour beers that are based, have quite a bit of wheat in them seem to work pretty well. Not that, I mean, you can do all barley soured beers, but at least most historical styles of beer, with the big exception of Berliner Weiss, tend to be have some wheat in the formulation.
Now, does the character of the wheat, is that brought out more or less by different strains of yeast? For example, on some of the 100% wheat beers that I've done, I've just made them as I would a hoppy pale ale or hoppy IPA, and using the Safale US-05 or a California ale yeast, there didn't seem to be that kind of spicy, clovey character that you traditionally think of with a wheat beer.
Yeah, that's all. The spicy clovey aspect comes straight from the yeast. There's special yeasts that have there's the Brewing Hefeweizen strains that just have the genes that are normally inactivated on brewer's yeast activated for producing these phenolic, well, they call them off flavors, but they're desired in a German wheat beer. But they're, essentially German wheat beer strains are what they call POF plus. They produce these phenolic compounds that in the beer that make the spice, and the clove and then the banana is an ester, and you can get those flavors without any wheat. For example, in Germany, there are Roggen beers, which are rye-based beers, and then they use that yeast and get the, sort of quote-unquote wheat beer characters out of it.
Speaking of rye, I have made a 100% rye beer as well, but that is a whole different ballgame. Rye is a lot more sticky than wheat. And that wound up being a very interesting experience. So what characteristics are we looking for with a rye beer, and how much can we use of that?
Well, rye has has a very characteristic flavor. Some people refer to pumpernickel bread, although there's also spices in pumpernickel which are different. But it's the best way to describe it is just to go try there are innumerable rye IPAs out there, rye pale ales. Just try one and you'll instantly get the different flavor from a normal pale ale. That's the rye. It's it's got it's described as spicy, which sort of doesn't help much. But it's hard to describe a flavor as in terms of other flavors when it's not, how would you describe strawberry if you can't use the word strawberry?
Right.
It's sort of something you gotta taste. But yeah, it has a characteristic taste to it. And yeah, it's very gummy, like you said. And people, it sort of depends on how much. If you're talking about rye malt and not raw rye or flake rye. But if you're talking about uh, either uh, either the malted rye or the flaked rye, you know, maybe 20% is going to give you a good amount of rye flavor in there. And if the higher you start creeping up, the more you're going to expect, you know, loudering problems. And then how high you could go is going to depend a lot on how your crush goes. If you really wanted to push the limit there, you might crush a little less finely, and how slow your lautering goes. But generally, I'm trying to think like what the I think the normal range for IPA, like what they use in there.
And if you've never crushed wheat or rye through your grain mill, and if you've got a hand cranked grain mill, you're going to know the difference immediately when the when the rye and the oat and the wheat hit those rollers.
Enjoy the workout.
It's a lot harder to work those through than barley. But yeah, you said you mentioned malted rye and malted wheat. Oats. That's another thing that people use as an adjunct in certain styles of beer.
Yep, oats are available frequently as flaked oats. You very occasionally see malted oats, and then you can go just buy oats some places too. So something like flaked oats, you could stir directly into your mash. If you were using just oats, then you might have to cereal mash that. I'm not quite sure.
And we can cover preparation here, kind of in more broad terms, a little bit later. But you can buy just a box, the little cylindrical box of Quaker oats in the store, can't you? And use those in your beer.
You could. Those would, I think, work just like flaked oats.
And that oats will give you kind of a, I've heard it described as a silky mouthfeel, like in an oatmeal stout, or even to an extreme kind of a slimy character as well.
Yeah, oats. Yeah, again, it's without using the word oats. It's sort of hard to describe the contribution of them. But yeah, there's a definite what do I want to say? There's a definite distinct flavor to it, and there's also a mouthfeel component too. And
you probably don't want to overdo it as far as the percentage of the grain bill, right?
No, most recipes I've ever seen that used oats, it's maybe up to 10%. And the most common use for oats is in like an oatmeal stout. And a lot of times there, people will they'll use flaked oats and they'll toast them a little bit to bring out that sort of oatmeal cookie flavor. Which if you use just normal flaked oats, it would be the sort of flavor of the oats would be much more subdued. But if you toast them a little bit, then it brings out that oatmeal cookie sort of character, which a lot of people expect in an oatmeal stout.
Mm-hmm. Then there are the evil adjuncts, or that are known as evil, and that's rice and corn that are used in big boy beers. But I haven't used rice, but I have used corn. Steve had some organic homegrown cornmeal that a friend had given him, and we made a sort of American style Pilsner with it, and it turned out very good. I mean, you don't have to go overboard, and if you do it right, you're not going to get a corny character with that grain, and it's fun to play with. I mean, it's another tool in your tool belt, so to speak. So rice and corn, are they so similar that you could talk about them together?
They are similar in a lot of ways. One way is there's a lot of products for brewers available for corn and rice. There's corn and rice syrups, which you can just use as kettle adjuncts. There's flaked maize, and there's flaked rice, which you can stir right into your mash. And then there's also raw rice or corn grits, and brewers use sort of degerminated corn grits. And these are both, because their gelatinization temperature is higher than typical mash temperatures. Those need to be cereal mashed. You heat them up separately with about 5% malt. Boil them, which breaks all the starch granules up. Then you typically have your main mash that you start out a little lower than normal, and when you add the boiled cereal mash to it, you given how much you're adding and how low your temperature was, you rig it so that brings you right up to your saccharification temperature.
So it's almost like you do a decoction mash.
It's similar to that, yeah. You boil a little bit of it separately, and in decoction mashing, it shares the idea that you mash in at a low temperature, then you boil part of it, and that when you add the boiled mash back, it raises the temperature.
So there are some grains that you can put straight into the mash tun without worry, right? I mean, if you see malted rye or malted wheat, it is pretty much ready to go right into the mash tun with the rest of the grain bill.
Right. Any mash or any grain that's malted, you can pretty much stir right into the mash. Likewise, anything that's flaked or torrefied, generally, or at least any of the grains that I've seen available, if it's flaked or torrefied, it's been the flaked ones have all been run through a hot roller and squished out, and the starch is all gelatinized. So those can be stirred right into the mash. Torrefied is like sort of puffed, and it's the same idea. You can stir that right into the mash. When it comes to raw grains or raw starches, then you might need to do some research and try to find the gelatinization temperature of the starch in the grain or other starch, because there are some that you can just stir right in, like for other starches, potato and sweet potato both have fairly low, and so you can just stir those right in. Barley, you can actually stir raw barley in. Same with wheat, but definitely for corn and rice, or if you were using sorghum, those would have to be boiled separately in the cereal mash to break up their starches.
And gelatinizing, that's the word that we hear for the starch preparation. It's just another term for making those starches available for the enzymes to work on in the mash tun?
Yeah, starch is it's a mixture of amylose and amylopectin. Amylose is just glucose molecules chained together from a specific carbon on each glucose to the next one. It's called a 1,4 linkage. And amylopectin is mostly chains of glucose that way, but there's the occasional 1,6 linkage, which breaks it sort of branch off. And different percentages of those and different average lengths of the amylose chains lead to different gelatinization temperatures. If you've got a lot of amylose and a long strains, the hydrogen bonds between the little strands are overall fairly strong, and that'll lead to a higher gelatinization temperature. So yeah, it's basically the temperature where the starch comes into solution and each little strand is floating freely and not hydrogen bonded to other strands of the starch. And there's also, I think, granule size also has some effect on the gelatinization temperature. I'm not sure about that, but it could. So yeah, just essentially some starches are, if you want to think of it this way, just packed together tightly enough that it takes higher temperatures to break them apart and get them into solution.
One interesting approach that Andy Sparks and I did for the big oatmeal stout that we did together, he had steel-cut oats, so they weren't, they were just basically oat seeds, I guess, just cut and
Right.
not mashed in any way or puffed or in any way. So instead of doing a traditional cereal mash with with malted barley in there with it, what he did was he basically made oatmeal and held the oatmeal overnight in his electric thermostatically controlled mash tun overnight, and just cooked them essentially.
Sure.
I forget what temperature he used, but it worked really well. I mean, then those went straight into the mash tun. We basically split the mash between two mash tuns, and we did brew in a bag with the part with the or mashed in a bag with the part with the oats in there, just to make sure that we didn't get a stuck sparge. But we had never done that before, and so we were curious to see if we were going to screw up the beer or not, but it didn't. It worked perfectly fine.
Yeah. Yeah, like if you were using a relatively small amount of some grain or other starch and you had like a big crock pot, you could just throw it in there, with a handful of crushed barley malt, turn it on high, let it boil for a little while and then use it. Yeah, just anything to if in doubt, you can always take the cereal mash approach, and you're not gonna screw up anything that way. Um, because sometimes it's weird. You would think that somewhere, in this day and age, there would just be a list of like grains and gelatinization temperatures, and there are, but it's kind of weird how different the numbers can be for something you would think like that would be pretty easy to measure. But you got to consider it's, first of all, the gelatinization temperature of starch isn't like the melting point of water. Water is, completely uniform. It's made up of, H2O molecules, and there's a very crisp sort of, transition between boiling and being a liquid and being frozen. With starch, you've got, mixtures of amylose and amylopectin, and it's how it's packed, and there can be a whole range of that. And then, there are different varieties of corn and rice and wheat and barley, and, they might have different granule sizes. They might have different percentages of amylose versus amylopectin. So, and, you don't know the pH that the temperature or, the study was conducted at. So like you can look around for the gelatinization temperature of different starches and find things that are, differ by as much as 10 degrees centigrade, which you would think would be like, how is that possible? But it is, so.
Well, what's the worst case scenario? Say I think I'm doing a cereal mash on some unmalted, unprepared adjunct grain, and I don't gelatinize the starches fully and put them in the mash tun. What's the worst that can happen?
Well, the worst that can happen if you divide it into two different problems. One, like not doing a cereal mash when you should have. In that case, you'll just end up with extra starch in your beer, and that can lead to haze, and that can also lead to biological instability. Although if you're otherwise clean and sanitary in all your things you do, and you drink the beer quickly, then the only problem is going to be whatever, however hazy the beer is. The other way, if you did a cereal mash and it didn't require it, that should really there really shouldn't be any problem. I mean, I suppose the higher temperature, maybe you extract a few more tannins from the grain, but I would not. I would say if you have any, if you're using any grain and you have any doubt as to whether you should do a cereal mash or not, go ahead and do the cereal mash because that's just it's just going to take that worry away from you that you're going to end up with starch.
There are other experimental grains coming on nowadays, especially spurred on by the gluten-free enthusiasm and interest. I looked on the Colorado Malting Company's website, and in addition to the malted sunflower seed, which I played with and had some fun with, they list malted amaranth, red proso millet, malted teff, and malted buckwheat. So, I have absolutely no experience with the rest of those, but it sounds like fun.
Yeah, it must be also interesting for them to try to, because there aren't established, here's how you malt teff. You've got to know enough about malting and then go in and start, just trying it and finding what the germination temperature is, finding out, how long you got to steep it, and basically finding out all the, finding out all the ways to malt that grain the best. And then, you're also competing against barley, for which hundreds of years now they've been doing, field trials and breeding new varieties specifically to be friendly to the malting process. And, these other grains are, you're just using grain. So yeah, it's interesting. And there's, in the future, who knows, beer recipes might be, two-row might not be the most common grain in every single recipe.
One day in the future.
Man, we'll have a permanent station on the moon.
Yeah, they'll be using Tranquility-based malt up there.
Dun-dun-dun.
They'll make beer that'll make your arm strong from drinking it and give you quite a buzz.
We'll all have flying cars, and our food will come in pill form.
Okay. Enough of that. Well,
computers may be as small as a large room.
One day you'll be able to make video phone calls. You'll have a phone that is small enough to fit on your wrist.
Yeah, like Dick Tracy.
Yeah. Well, all right, Chris, this has been fun. Maybe we will have to get back together and talk about enzymes. I'll have to look into. Have we talked about that in the past? I'll have to look in the archives and see.
We haven't.
Well, there you go. It's a date. All right. Until then, Chris, we will talk to you later.
Okie doke. Thanks for having me on the show, James.
Thanks again to Chris. If you have any questions about enzymes, check out his stories on beerandwinejournal.com, and then send your questions to me so I can send them to Chris and we can discuss them next time we get together to talk about enzymes. It should be a very interesting show. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. On Friday, you will find our bottle openers back on our shop, I hope. Our Basic Brewing growler bags are available. Protect your precious homebrew and craft beers. You take it from place to place. Check out our support link, where you can throw a couple of bucks into the tip jar by subscribing financially to our podcasts. Be sure to check out our DVDs, Extract Brewing and Partial Mashing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. You can find them all on our site, along with our combo deals when the openers get back in stock, because we are giving away a free bottle opener with any combo deal. And you can also check out our Basic Brewing shirts in the store as well, along with our logbooks. Keep track of up to 50 batches of beer. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online at our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We greatly appreciate the support. The site is down on the associate section of Amazon, so I couldn't look up featured products this week. But I tell you, it's tough to choose every week what to choose from, because y'all buy a bunch of stuff, and we get a little chunk of whatever you buy. You don't have to, you don't pay any extra. How complicated can I make it? Anyway, that's all. Until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by our buddy Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.